More Money Show with Steve Moore. Entertaining and informative on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Welcome back, folks. I hope you're having a wonderful Halloween weekend. I hope you got a lot of candy yesterday. And we're going to be taking your calls at the second half hour of the show. I've left a lot of time open to hear from you because I care so much about your opinion. And I always say we have the smartest listeners in the country on WABC. So that call-in number, don't call in quite yet because we got a segment on the economy coming up, but I want to hear from you in the second half hour. That number, write it down, 1-800-848-9222, 1-800-848-9222, or easier way to remember is 1-800-848-WABC. And I want to hear about what you're thinking about the election coming up, what you think about the condition of the economy. Maybe we could talk a little bit about the government shutdown. Who do you blame for that? I blame everybody. I think Washington's totally corrupt and inept. But in the meantime, I want to switch gears and talk about the economy. We have two outstanding economists. I know because I've worked with them over the years, and I value their opinion and their insights and their intelligence just about more than anybody I know on economics. So Tomas Philipson, you all know Tom. He's been on our show many times and was the former chief economist. How cool is this? He was the former chief economist for Donald Trump at the Council of Economic Advisors in Trump's first term. And Mr. Producer, do we have EJ on?
Yes.
Okay. And EJ Antoni, who is an outstanding economist. If there was any righteousness in this world, he would now be the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But he is an economist at the Heritage Foundation. He works with me at Unleash Prosperity. So, gentlemen, thanks for joining. Tom, let's start with you, and I want to ask EJ this question as well. Did the Federal Reserve do the right thing yesterday? I'm kind of on the fence of this. I could go either way, but what is your opinion about what the action the Fed took yesterday in terms of their quarter point reduction in interest rates?
Yeah, I'm an economist that don't believe in this fine-tuning that the Fed can do, essentially. A lot of economists
I'm with you on that, totally. Yes, that's why. Yeah, I guess great minds think alike. Why, Tom, let me just let me just interrupt you for 1 second here, because you're why is it that all of Wall Street and all the media is so hyper obsessed about, they might cut a quarter percentage point of this interest rate or that interest rate. By the way, nobody borrows at the federal funds rate. The last time we cut, people say, they should cut rates to bring the mortgage rate down. But back when Biden was president, when they lowered the Fed funds rate, the mortgage rate went up. So I don't really understand this obsession.
Well, these are bureaucrats that are setting price controls in short-term credit markets, essentially, right? So if you're setting prices, you will have a lot of attention, unfortunately. And we have Fed Watch, we have Fed Speak, we have, everything surrounding it. We have, updates on what that governor said at this meeting, et cetera. So I think, it's an obsession with the financial markets because it's setting prices instead of focusing on demand and supply forces that will set prices. They're focusing on the bureaucrats setting the prices. That's kind of understandable. It's obviously not a good institution, I think, the way it's operating now. And I have actually argued that the lack of data that they're getting might actually be a good thing for the economy because they're too too data dependent usually, and just they're an enormous force of systemic risk in financial markets, which obviously they were set up to avoid. They're also enormous force for price instability. They generated 30% in growth in the money supply, and they're basically the ones generating inflation as opposed to stabilizing prices. So I think, the more they can be rule-based, in my view, the better, as opposed to trying to all this fine-tuning and thinking that a quarter point of a short-term credit market will drive 330 million people's economic activity. I think a little bit misguided.
Well, yeah, that's well said, because I agree with every word of that. And, I have a good friend who's a big supporter of ours at Unleash Prosperity, who's a hedge fund manager, very successful, and he likes volatility. That's how he makes his money. And before I turn to EJ, Tom, all the Fed does is create volatility and unpredictability.
You're asking EJ or me?
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, EJ, let us turn to you. Thanks for joining. I don't know. What do you think about this discussion of the Fed? I just think that I'm with Steve Forbes and Larry Kudlow. Why not just have a price rule and let everybody knows what it is when you're going to, if inflation goes up by a certain amount, we're going to, raise the interest rates a little bit. If they go, in other words, tell Americans and investors what the rule is and just stick to the rule.
Steve, it's a great question. But think of it this way. If you're one of the 300 plus PhD economists at the Fed, that would put you out of a job, wouldn't it? So the last thing you're going to do is recommend that.
There are too many economists out there.
But I think you and Tomas are making really great points here. And just to show how effective a rule-based system would be, we had a rule-based system before the Fed. We had a gold standard, right?
And we had stable prices.
Exactly. From not even the time of our nation's founding, but even before the nation's founding. You can go back to colonial times, and if you look at what an ounce of gold could buy then, and you compare it to 1913 when the Fed was created, there was literally no inflation over that entire time period. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. Compare that to what the Fed has given us since 1913, and it's something crazy like the dollar's lost 97 or 98% of its value over that time. I mean, it's astonishing, but that's the reality. And again, it speaks to the fact that, a handful of people, in this case, 12 people, are not going to be able to fine tune an economy. It's absolutely true. This is central planning in its worst form, I think.
Yeah, the problem, of course, EJ, is you're going to put 300 PhD economists out of a job. If you have your way, and then they're going to compete with us, right? No, but there are too many, people who think they know the answer, and Jerome Powell doesn't know all the answers. He's the one who let inflation go up by 21.5% when Biden came into office in his 4 years. So he doesn't have a very good track record. I want to ask you both another related question to this. By the way, I'm not necessarily in favor of a gold standard, but I do think you could take maybe a commodity index of looking, the type of everything from beef to wheat to copper to coal. And, there's an index that keeps track of that. And if that price is going up, then that's a lead indication we're going to have inflation. So we want to pull some money out of the economy. If the prices are going down, maybe you might have deflation. So you have to put more money in the economy. It doesn't seem that complicated to me. But the second problem I see, Thomas, is that there is something that Larry Kudlow calls a kind of growth phobia at the Fed. They think if the economy is growing, that it's going to overheat. I don't even understand what that means. And, growth is a good thing. Why wouldn't you want the economy to grow as fast as it can?
Yeah, more importantly, there's no empirical basis. It's dogma at the Fed and also in D.C. in the bubble that unemployment and inflation has a relationship with so-called Phillips curve. And the evidence for that is very, very weak. But, and therefore they're afraid of cutting rates. We had, zero rates for a decade without inflation just recently, right? So
yes.
That's one example of why cutting rates might not necessarily lead to inflation. But in general, I think the gold standard, that's one alternative. I think in the distant future, maybe not so close, but maybe closer than you think, is that crypto is, fixed supply medium of exchange that's decentralized and doesn't have this monopoly nature of the Fed in order to increase supply and decrease supply. Crypto is for, a transaction, what email was for the post office. They're going to basically bypass the centralized system with a decentralized one. And I've argued in the past, the key thing with crypto, if it actually grows to that extent, is that you're not going to have fractional reserve banking, meaning, banks only hold part of their deposits in the bank. And that's why you get bank runs being so central. And that's why you get all this government regulation of banks because they're afraid of bank runs. The most recent one is FDIC being proposed to insure deposits up to $10 million. Yes. But you're not going to have bank runs with a cryptocurrency, essentially. So I think that's unrecognized advantage of having a decentralized medium of exchange as opposed to the centralized we have with, any currency that's government granted.
Yeah, well said. And, EJ, it is true that, one of the reasons that I'm in favor of cryptos, and by the way, I don't invest in cryptos. I know many of you listening to the show do. And I hope you do, because crypto's done very well, especially if you've owned Bitcoin. But, EJ, I want to go back to something that, Thomas just mentioned, because we've been writing about this at the hotline, Unleash Prosperity. This idea sounds crazy to me, to raise the guaranteed amount on deposits in a bank to, what was the number?
10 million.
10 million. I mean, who's that going to be? Warren Buffett and Bill Gates and LeBron James? I mean, who has $10 million? I think that's a terrible idea.
99% of deposits are covered by the current 250,000, right?
Yes.
So we're talking about the 1% of deposits that are not covered. Yeah.
Yeah. And plus, if you go up to 10 million, I mean, who has $10 million? But EJ, what do you think about that idea?
I think it's another case of the special interests trying to socialize losses. In other words, get the taxpayer to bail them out. We saw this with Silicon Valley Bank in I think it was March of 2023, where they essentially they broke the rules and they gave deposit coverage to a lot of money that did not have deposit coverage. And the reason for that is because it was essentially a bunch of wealthy, it was very wealthy Democrat donors primarily who had their money, who were going to lose their money rather, because the bank went bust. And the reason the bank went bust is because they sold off all of their interest rate hedges. In other words, these were financial instruments that would protect them if interest rates changed pretty dramatically, which is exactly what happened. And then the bank went bust, and those people should have lost their money. Those are the rules of the game. You gamble, and it doesn't all, you put it all in red, and it comes up black. And in this case, the taxpayer bailed them out.
Well, I think that what's also dangerous about this, about the folks, we're talking about there are some senators and congressmen who want to raise the amount of guaranteed, that you get, the deposit insurance, that they will insure you 100% for. Right now it's up to $250,000 deposit. And I think that's a fine policy. It prevents, bank runs like we saw in the 1930s, but 10 million? I mean, you're talking about only a small percentage of the population that would ever, and by the way, who would take $10 million into a savings account anyway?
Right. And Steve, just to show you how ridiculous this is, when deposit insurance was first proposed in the 1930s that you just mentioned, FDR almost vetoed the bill. It was a much larger bill. It had a lot of other banking components in it, but FDR almost vetoed the bill because even he recognized that this was going to create a moral hazard, that this would have essentially incentivized banks and the leadership of banks to take unnecessary risks because they knew the taxpayer would have to bail them out.
Yeah. And this is a key point, because we want people who invest a lot of money into a bank to be the guardians of the policies of the bank. And so if you just tell an investor, you can put $10 million into an investment and we're going to guarantee it, then who's going to be the watchdog?
Exactly. No one is, because everyone knows that if you lose, it doesn't matter. Everyone's a winner. This is the financial equivalent
the taxpayer.
Of giving every kid a trophy. Right. Yeah, exactly. Except the taxpayer. Right.
Well, we've only got a minute. By the way, I'd love to hold you. I'm talking to Tom Philipson, who was former chief economist for Donald Trump at the Council of Economic Advisor, and E.J. Antoni, who is the chief economist at the Heritage Foundation, two of the smartest economists. By the way, could I hold you guys over for one more segment?
Sure.
Okay, because this is a great conversation. We're getting a lot of response to this. So I guess the question on the way out then, before we go to our second segment together, is how worried, and I'll start with you, Tom, and then EJ, how worried are you about inflation? My wife is very worried. She gets angry at me every time I come home, and she tells me that the grocery prices are outrageously high. So what do you make of the inflation situation right now?
Well, I'm a believer that most economists are, it's not just me, that inflation is caused by monetary and fiscal policies.
Yes.
So it's not caused by other things. Essentially, all this tariff discussion, I think, is very, very misguided, which may raise some tariffed good prices, but that is not inflation, which economists refer to, average or economy level prices, essentially economy-wide price increases. Mm-hmm. So I think, the enormous supply stimulus that's coming from the deregulation and the tax cuts obviously has downward pressure on prices. Mm-hmm. And also what's missed with all these trade deals, I think, it's just a discussion of the tariffs, which is basically the stick used to negotiate with, is that we have federal, foreign direct investment coming into the U.S. now in the trillions. It used to be $250 billion a year the last 10 years, and now it's coming in the trillions, essentially.
Yes.
That's not great for trade deficits, but it's great for our economy.
It sure is.
Expanding supply in the economy.
There you go. Okay, EJ, very quickly, should we be worried about inflation?
I am not nearly as much as the last 4 or 5 years, but I think the Fed showed us this last week that they're basically giving up in any of their attempts to fight inflation. So if we want prices to come down, we're going to need regulatory policy, regulatory reform that lowers prices that way. We're going to need a lot more energy supply to bring prices down that way. I just don't think we're going to get any help from the Fed for a couple of years here.
Okay. We're going to take a quick break. I'm talking to two of the best economists in the country, EJ Antoni and Tomas Philipson. And when we come back, we're going to talk about could we get life-saving drugs on the market faster than they're coming out at the snail's pace? Can we save lives with people with cancer and heart disease and Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and all these potential life-saving drugs? And we were going to talk about how we can bring those drugs to market faster. This is the More Money Show on WABC. Welcome back, folks. It's the More Money Show. Hope you're having a splendid weekend. It is gorgeous in most places on the East Coast, all the way up in Maine, all the way down to Georgia and Florida. I live in the D.C. area. It is absolutely a splendorific day. So as soon as this show is over, I'm going to get out and enjoy the, kind of warm weather and beautiful blue skies and sunshine. I hope you do too. We're going to talk in this next segment with my two guests, by the way, if you're just joining, are Tomas Philipson, who was a chief economist for Donald Trump at the Council of Economic Advisors, and gave Trump a lot of great advice in his first term, and EJ Antoni, who's the chief economist at the Heritage Foundation. So nobody better to ask for great advice on the economy. And before we get to the issue, I want to talk that I mentioned before the break, which is how can we bring new drugs to the market speedier so that we can save lives. I want to just throw one quick one to you, EJ. You're an expert on the job market, the labor market. The Fed said that they're worried about slow job growth. What is your sort of overall take on the jobs market right now?
Well, I think it's in the middle of a transition. Part of what's happening with job growth slowing is the fact that you're getting rid of so many federal employees. We just had over 100. We just had over 100,000 of them, Steve. As you know, they took this early buyout closer to the beginning of the year, and now they are officially being removed from the roles. They were getting
and that's a good thing.
Months.
That's a good thing, right?
Right, exactly. It's 100% right, Steve. This is part of what the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent keeps talking about, a reprivatization, he calls it.
I like that. Yes.
So instead of government spending going up, if you look at government purchases in the last couple of GDP reports, it was actually slightly negative. It has no growth at all.
And that's a good thing.
Exactly. So the increase in spending is coming from consumers. We're seeing the same thing in the labor market, I think. But that does mean there's a lot of turbulence. There's it's a period of transition. But I think once that transition is done, once the drama around tariffs is worked out, for example, once you start seeing the effects of full expensing coming back and the increase in investment that will bring, I think that's when we start really returning to some more robust job growth.
Okay, good analysis. So, Tom, you and I had a piece in the New York Post a couple of weeks ago about an issue that I care about deeply, and you do, and so many of our listeners do, about how we can try to bring an end to some of the terrible horrible diseases that still affect mankind, whether it's heart disease or cancer or MS or Parkinson's, Lou Gehrig's disease. All of these things can be cured and with American know-how and our great researchers. And one of our frustrations, and I'd like you to talk about this, is that it takes so long for a new drug that is very promising to dealing with sometimes these fatal diseases to get on the market. And as Milton Friedman taught us 40, 50 years ago, when the FDA releases a drug and says, hey, this is going to save 50,000 lives a year, but they hold it up for 3 years, they've just cost 150,000 lives. So it's taking too long, isn't it? And what could we do to get drugs on the market faster?
Yeah, and it's taking enormous time. It sometimes takes a decade for these things to go through the FDA process. Imagine if we had computer hardware and software taking a decade to go on the market. Right. We would be on America Online, and we'd basically be transitioning off America Online right now.
Right.
So
that's true.
So the key thing here is that there's two things FDA does to slow it down. One is to regulate safety, which I think we should keep. The other one is, since 1962, there was an amendment to the FDA Act, and they are now, since then, regulating effectiveness, which is essentially telling you whether the product is working, whether the drug is working or not, essentially. That, I think, is what's slowing it down, and that's what leads to the large, expensive trials that slows everything down. And we have 85% of healthcare outside of drugs, which is, about 15% of spending. 85% of healthcare is not overseen by government bureaucrats in terms of the quality being delivered to patients, essentially. And that seems to be working well. American healthcare is the norm, or is the envy of many countries, because everyone who gets sick comes here when they're really sick, essentially. So we don't have a quality problem, oversight problem in that 85% of our spending. And in fact, we don't have it even for drugs, because a lot of drugs are what's called off-label. And that's a term which is just a technical term. But what that means is once you get a drug approved for, let's say, one cancer, breast cancer, you can use it for other cancers off-label, meaning without FDA approval. Off the label. The label just tells you what FDA approved, the evidence that FDA had to approve it for that particular disease. But you can use it for other diseases still, and which have not been FDA approved. And that's usually the norm, particularly in cancer. There's a lot of off-label use in cancer. So if we can do it, if the private sector can figure out what works off-label or not, why can't they do it for the first disease that FDA sits on for 10 years, essentially?
Well, let me give you a good example of something that because Tom and I, since we've written our piece, have gotten a lot of response on that, and a lot of it from biotech companies who say they have very promising drugs that have been held up by the FDA for not just months, but many years. One example is there's a promising new drug. Obviously, everybody's getting worried about Alzheimer's because we're getting older. I'm a baby boomer. I just turned 65. And there's this promising drug that looks like they can't prevent Alzheimer's, but they can slow its development. So if you start taking it at an earlier age, they can slow sort of the spread of that terrible disease. So you have more productive years, and there's no negative effects of it. So, I would start taking that drug right away, because it might, I have Alzheimer's in my family, and if I can delay the onset of something like that, why shouldn't I have why shouldn't I have the right to take this drug?
Well, you should. That's the pithy answer. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. You look at, and I know you and Tomas already know this, but just for the benefit of the audience, you look at the record of a regulatory body like the FDA. And yes, they have a couple of wins, I guess you could say, where they banned certain drugs, perhaps, that were available in Europe or in other places around the world. And the result of that, because they said, we don't think this is safe, a regulatory body elsewhere in the world said, no, it's fine. And it turned out it wasn't safe. So yes, they have succeeded a couple of times in that way. But by and large, they've had a heck of a lot more, I guess you could say, false negatives than false positives. In other words, they have banned, as you guys know, or held up approval for so many drugs that you can get elsewhere around the world that they have cost lives because of that. And the net effect is they have cost far more lives on net, in my opinion, than they have saved. In other words, they've literally resulted in it's literally been a net effect of increasing death.
Yeah, I remember there was a very famous debate between do you remember Jim Tobin, the economist? I think he was at Yale. I think he won a Nobel Prize, and Milton Friedman. And they were debating about regulation. And Milton Friedman said, well, regulation kills people. And Jim Tobin said, what are you talking about? It saves lives. And he said, no, the FDA is killing people by keeping safe, life-saving drugs off the market. So sometimes, EJ, over-regulation does more damage than the regulation itself.
Exactly. And unfortunately, a lot of times it's not just medicine. This extends to, every aspect of life you could imagine. There are so many times, Steve, when the regulators are trying to do the math essentially and say, all right, how much is this particular regulation going to save consumers money, let's say? Maybe a really good example is clothes washers. Right, clothes washers today are nowhere near as effective as they used to be because of all these different requirements on things like water usage. And so a lot of people have to wash their clothes literally 2 times because doing it once just won't get them clean. Or you have to only fill the washer halfway because if you fill it all the way, again, the clothes aren't going to get clean. And consumers end up using more water on net, not less.
Yeah, same thing with toilets. They have these, we're going to save water by, reducing the flush capacity of a toilet. So now you have to flush the toilet twice. So you use more water. So I want to go back to drugs for a minute with Tomas Philipson because this is an area he's an expert on. So one, EJ brought up the issue of safety. And just to be clear, we're saying we want to make sure the drugs are safe before they are approved, but that, let consumers and patients decide for themselves if it's safe, whether they want to use it.
Well, what happens, and that's correct, but why the person, if you ask a person FDA to, what they think about this, they're going to say you're crazy, obviously, and then
why? Wait, hold on. Why are they going to say we're crazy?
What they're going to say, the misperception is, I get it to it. The misperception is that if the government did not generate this evidence on the quality of the products, which we don't have in a lot of other industries, that the government has to mandate that you produce quality information in this way. So if the government didn't do that, then it'd just be a Wild West. But that's misleading because the insurance companies are going to clearly demand that these products work before they pay for them, essentially. Patients are going to demand that the products work. Doctors are going to demand that the products work before they use it. So essentially, the public sector is crowding out private sector activity in generating this evidence. The reason the private sector is currently not doing it is because the government is overdoing it. And the private sector will basically step in here. Payers or, insurance companies are already demanding effectiveness of the products, the cost of it, what's called the cost effectiveness of these drugs, etc. But it's just going to be done much more efficiently and quicker than the FDA does it once the private sector is going to do it.
Well, I'll give you an example of where this is really harmful because I do invest. I'm not a huge investor, but I invest in some startup drugs that are very promising. And the problem is, when I talk to people in that industry, EJ, it takes on average, anywhere from $100 million to $500 million, $500 million to bring a new drug to market. And in many cases, too many cases, the startup company that has 1 or 2 drugs that they're trying to bring to market, they run out of capital before they can bring the drug to the market. And so that discourages, in other words, if it's going to take, let's say 5 years to bring the drug to market rather than 10 years, then there's going to be more investment in the drug, in the cure, in winning the race for the cure.
100%, Steve. Absolutely. And the other important thing is that, as our good friend Dr. Laffer always likes to say, if you tax something more, you get less of it, right? If you subsidize something more, you get more of it. Well, this is effectively you can think of it as a kind of tax because you are making it more expensive. If you make it more expensive, you're going to get less of it. And so not only is it a matter of, it's going to take longer to get this drug to market. Mm-hmm. Let's say it is a life-saving drug, and instead of it being here in 5 years, it's here in 10. Now anyone who could have used this drug over those 5 years could very well die. But the other important thing is that there are a lot of drugs under this kind of framework, which it's not even a matter of they're delayed 5 years, they're delayed forever. Because if a drug, let's say, is, maybe it's profitable with a certain level of investment, but if it needs a lot more investment, then it becomes unprofitable, right? Well, if that's the case, which, as you pointed out, it's going to take longer. It's going to take more investment now to bring this drug to market. That means some of these drugs, in a marginal case, just aren't going to be created at all, and no one will ever get them.
Exactly. So we just have a minute left, Thomas. So I want to close with you. You were involved with Operation Warp Speed. That's how you and I got, how I got interested in this in the first place. And Operation Warp Speed was an incredible success. Everybody said it would take 3 or 4 years to get a vaccine. You all in the Trump administration in his first term got that vaccine out in 9 months. Why can't we have Operation Warp Speed for cancer, heart disease, multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's, all of the major diseases?
And that's what would happen if you relaxed or repealed this 1962 amendment to the FDA Act, essentially, that things would come on market much, much quicker for every disease. That, on top of it, would, align with more price competition. So drugs costs will come down as well because you're going to have competition coming in a lot quicker than they otherwise would. FDA now is sort of entry barriers for a lot of competition. So if you make it through, it's great, because you have all these entrants stopped by the FDA. So you can basically go in and have a monopoly much longer than you could with more sort of vibrant competition.
Well, it's not just about more money, which is what this show is about, but it's also about saving lives and extending life. And we should do this. So I hope Donald Trump is listening, because he did an amazing job on our Operation Warp Speed. We did Operation Warp Speed for every terrible disease out there, and we can save a lot of lives with this, folks. So we will be right back. By the way, EJ, Antoni, Thomas Philipson, thanks so much for joining. And I'll be taking your calls when we get back. It is 1-800-848-9222 if you want to weigh on any of these issues. We'll be back in 2 minutes.
Thanks for listening to More Money with Steve Moore. You can hear More Money with Steve Moore Saturday afternoons at 1. If you like the podcast, share it with your friends and listen anytime at WABCRadio.com and download the WABC Radio app. Hit that subscribe button on all major podcast platforms. Plus, follow WABC on social on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and X. See you next time for a new episode so you never have to wonder,
what the heck is going on here?